called teenagers until 1941, this group of Americans were of tremendous interest to social scientists at the dawn of the 20th century. To religious leaders, social purists, and other adults, teens were either potential members of the nuclear family or sexual deviants in the making. In this episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, we'll be discussing purity, promiscuity, and the American teen in the 20th century. I would certainly hate to be a teen in the 18th and 19th centuries. For starters, that age group didn't really exist. Black teens, as we know, were either enslaved or free, with very often a lack of agency or access to resources. Among whites, working class teens worked from an early age and rarely received formal educations. Wealthy white teens tended to go into the family business or military at the same age that modern teens would be graduating from high school. It also wasn't unheard of for wealthy boys as young as 14 to attend college. Dating in the early 19th century was a term associated with prostitution. Courtship, or dating purely with the intent to get engaged and married, was the way of life, and it reflected the primitiveness and rigidity of the era. For example, in New England and some middle colonies in the 18th century, there was a practice called bundling. As space was limited in family homes, unmarried young couples were allowed to sleep in the same bed fully clothed, with wooden boards kept between them to prevent premarital sex. The whole point being not only to protect one from sin, but to create perfectly legitimate heirs. Courting was mainly done between two members of the same community in the woman's home under the watchful eye of parents and siblings. Arranged marriages were popular in the 18th century, especially among elite families to protect assets. While purity was important across the board, if premarital sex happened, the couple was expected to get married. A woman who gave birth out of wedlock was usually shamed. While there were more rules about acceptable courtship back in the day compared to modern people, early Americans grew up faster. One glaring example of the lack of existence of a teenage stage in early America is the age of consent laws. During the 19th century, the age of consent in most states was 10 to 16 years old. All in all, there was no overarching teenage culture. But in the 20th century, one major phenomenon would bring together the group that came to be known as teenagers. I'm of course talking about high school. By the 1920s, almost 3/4 of eligible American youth were enrolled in high school, but even those who weren't enrolled were living in a completely different world than their parents and grandparents. More young people than ever lived in big cities, and the country overall was becoming less rural. Dance halls, popular culture via silent movies, and jazz music, the predecessors of concert arenas, rated R movies, and rock music, terrified American elders. It was during this period that evangelicals were heavily condemning modern and mass culture as evil that would seduce and destroy American youth. They of course were concerned from a racial standpoint, as urbanization quite frequently meant integration. In the South especially, this was all the more reason to influence and groom white children to reject immorality or impurity. As one South Carolina reverend put it, "It's the solemn duty of the home, of the parents, to conserve the morals of the white race." The South believed that it had a girl problem, mainly among white ones. Black girls weren't focused on, as they were believed to be naturally immoral beyond repair. Leaders viewed rural white girls as innocent but lazy and stupid, and urban girls as sleazy and nefarious. The desired white girl was the educated Southern new woman who was modest, active, and supportive of white male supremacy and her civic duties. So, concerned white Southerners built reformatories and mused about the failing morals of white girls who dared to venture to big cities, work among men, and dress scandalously for the time. They also implemented sterilization programs, which we'll discuss in episode 7 of Let's Talk About Sex History. Gone were the days of courtship being the reigning practice. Suddenly, teens had much more intimate moments with potential suitors. The emergence of the mass-manufactured car propelled further teenage independence. It's probably why 40 to 50% of teens during this period had participated in petting or sexual touching. And the act was most common among middle and upper class teens who had access to cars. These teens attended homogenous schools, often belonged to private country and social clubs, and could date in their insulated class and race bubbles. When boys in this group wanted full intercourse, they often approached lower class women who had more relaxed attitudes about premarital sex. According to one estimate, during this period, working class teens were twice as likely to have had sexual intercourse. At the same time that white adults were concerned with the sexuality of white teens, black social scientists began studying the topic of black teen sexuality. After 1933, during the Great Depression, most teens lost their jobs to unemployed adult men and instead went to school. It was the first time the majority of age people were enrolled in school, and suddenly they weren't workers but students. Back in the 20s, most states had raised the age of consent laws to 16 to 18. This group of high school age people was fresh and therefore ripe for criticism, studies, and new regulations. According to historian Susan Kahn, in the 30s, policymakers feared this age group might form a lost Depression era generation that, due to chronic unemployment, would grow alienated from American economic and political ideals. In 1935, the American Youth Commission was founded to gather data on the nation's youth and propose policies based on the results. The program paid special attention to the South and black youth because of their perceived greater risk of social maladjustment. Despite being lumped all together as hypersexual, studies of black youth found various attitudes about sex stratified by class and region. Middle-class blacks tended to have higher expectations of chastity and strict moral codes, reflecting respectability politics. Among poor rural blacks, they shared with their rural white neighbors a lack of cars and privacy, leading to informal relationships and sexual liaisons in outside areas. Said one disgruntled black rural male teen, "There ain't no decent place to take a girl. If you ain't got a car, you just ain't nowhere." Said one black Mississippi female teen on sex, "You don't love if you don't do that," going on to say that her peers tended to do it after parties or sometimes after church suppers on the way home. Among urban blacks and their white neighbors, informal relationships were accompanied with more money and activities, foreshadowing the dating culture we have today. By 1945, this dating culture would be more mainstream. That year, a Georgia representative at the federally backed Social Protection Division, which targeted prostitution, said, "I find it difficult to draw a line between the girl who grants her favors for a certain sum of money and her sister who will indulge in identical activities for a T-bone steak." In 1937, sociologist Willard Waller published a study in the American Sociology Review describing a phenomenon among teens called the campus rating complex. Also called promiscuous popularity by historian Beth Bailey, it encompassed teens literally competing for dates. Boys showed how popular they were by having money, nice clothes, a car, and friends. Girls needed to be in demand by the popular boys. This pre-war dating system emphasized popularity and having as many dates as possible. Girls were expected to be selective about petting, maintain their reputations as good girls, and to not be the wrong type of popular. After the war, when there was determined to be a shortage of eligible men to marry, girls would date early and go steady as soon as possible. But more on that a little later. Something of growing importance for these teens of the 20s through 40s was appearance. This was a product of the new times, as it was the first period in which ready-made clothing was widely and easily available in stores and catalogs. Appearance wasn't just about personal expression, but also about signaling one's status to your peers. According to Kahn, several wealthier African American teenagers interviewed by sociologists in the late 30s mentioned that girls with fewer clothes were rough and loud, terms that referred doubly to physical quality and to an imputed lack of morals and manners. Among both the white and black working class, participating in what Kahn called the economy of desire by purchasing clothes, makeup, and accessories contributed to self-satisfaction that lay in uneasy proximity to shame and envy. It's no surprise, therefore, that many social scientists of the day noted the regularity of teen girls dropping out of school to work and become consumers, and girls trading dates or sex for clothes. Appearance came to be seen as an essential component of social mobility for lower class girls. After all, how would they attract a rich, good-looking fella if they didn't look the part? Many sociologists noted these teens' frequent desires to marry well off, or if not possible, to be successful and independent. In this way, clothing was not only a means of expression or status signaling, but as a way to fantasize about the future. The biggest sexual fears among teens of this era was getting messed up. For boys, that meant venereal disease, and for girls, that meant pregnancy. A 13-year-old Nashville black boy explained, "Sometimes you liable to get the girl messed up and she'll have a baby. Then her people are gonna want you to marry her and take care of her. I wouldn't marry her though." Even still, among all groups of black Americans, marriage was a common occurrence. From 1890 to 1960, the black marriage rate was always above 61%. However, in studies from the 1930s on black adolescents, rural black girls were growing discontent with the idea of marriage as something romantic, instead seeing it as something that needed to provide security and stability. Many didn't see the security in their tiny farm towns, represented by a teen who said, "Before I marry a farmer, I wouldn't marry at all." A number expressed sentiments like 14-year-old Sadie Barnes, who said, "I don't want to lose my pleasure, my freedom. I don't want anyone to boss me." Others dreamed about leaving their small towns for the big city and placated their desires with trips to local juke joints for dancing, flirting, and fun. According to historian Nicholas Syrett, in 1880, when the U.S. Census first started tracking the marriage of persons under the age of 20, it found that 11.7% of 15 and 19-year-old girls were wives. That number dipped in 1890 and then increased incrementally through the 1920s to 12.6% in 1930. Youthful marriage decreased, as did the overall marriage rate during the Great Depression. It then rose again dramatically after World War II. In 1962, a sociologist warned, "Too many parents encourage their youngsters to date, go steady, attend formal dances, and take part in other boy-girl activities, thereby forcing heterosexual relationships before children are ready for them." This sociologist obviously studied the events and trends of the previous decade, because the 1950s was defined by going steady. According to Bailey, in earlier days, going steady had been more like the old-fashioned keeping steady company. It was a step along the path to marriage, even if many steady couples parted company before they reached the altar. By the early 1950s, going steady had acquired a totally different meaning. It was no longer the way a marriageable couple signaled their deepening intentions. Instead, going steady was something 12-year-olds could do and something most 15-year-olds did do. Few steady couples expected to marry each other, but for the duration of the relationship acted as if they were married. Going steady had become a sort of play marriage, a mimicry of actual marriage.
Dad, I had expected you to be mad when I told you. A couple of years ago, you used to worry if I dated the same girl twice in a row.
Yes, Mother and I used to worry about you going steady. Still do some. But you're older now. Mother and I think that you're better able to cope with the problems that go with going steady.
Yes. You've played the field for 2 or 3 years, Jeff. Now you begin to settle on one girl, to date her rather steadily for a while. Of course, the first time you go steady, you don't expect it to be permanent.
Permanent?
Mother and I went steady for quite a while. But it wasn't the first time for either of us.
What your father means is you'll likely go steady with several different girls before you begin to think seriously about marriage.
After World War II, as you know, there was a significant baby and marriage boom. Prior to this era, the highest teen marriage rates were among black people and poor and rural white people. But the glorification of white middle-class nuclear families coincided with the budding of heterosexual teenage culture, made possible by the growth of high schools and the influence of suburbia. Middle and upper-class white teens were given more boy-girl bonding time than ever before. In their cookie-cutter neighborhoods like Levittown, there were activities and locations just for teens, where relationships were nourished. There were differences between the races and classes too. For example, in the South, black teens tended to have greater freedom after school compared to white teens, as both parents tended to work outside of the home. While in school, they had more supervision compared to white teens, who had less teacher supervision and had more romance culture in the hallways. Lovers' lanes became more popular for some class groups as cars became more accessible. For schools that could afford them, yearbooks highlighted superlatives for most attractive and best couple. While dance was initially a sign of sin and immorality among religious folk, by the 1950s, formal dances were seen as a wholesome way to regulate teen fun and keep them away from more sinful influences like interracial events and couplings. Another common component of 1950s high schools were family life courses, primitive versions of sex ed that emphasized that normal teen girls and boys were expected to desire romance, marriage, and babies. This fit in with the Red Scare culture of the era in which homosexuals were targeted and vilified. However, the young age that many young women decided to pursue marriage alarmed some parents. High school dropout rates among white teen girls skyrocketed during this period, in large part thanks to teen pregnancies and subsequent shotgun marriages. By 1959, 1 of every 4 18-year-old girls was married, and teen marriage rates were highest on average among Southern women. In 1960, about half of all brides were under the age of 20. Observers of this period found that the 3 biggest factors for teen marriage in the 50s were that teens wanted to grow up and be adults, wanted to experience guilt-free sex, or more commonly, needed to avoid the shame of being unwed mothers. That's right. While some of these teens were having play marriages while going steady, some were actually getting busy and getting pregnant. So marriage was the usual next step. Studies showed and still show that the divorce rate is higher among those who marry in their teens. The average marriage age overall would go back up in the 1960s. Teen marriage wasn't the only pressing issue of teen sexuality during the 50s. teen culture itself was under scrutiny. For example, between 1950 and 1955, Ebony magazine published a number of sensationalized pieces about outrageous sexual behavior among teens, including premarital sex, alleged sex clubs, and orgies. This kind of coverage fell by the wayside when the civil rights movement picked up steam. The emergence of rock music and stars like Elvis Presley caused unforeseen teen girl frenzies at music halls across the country. Parents and sociologists were absolutely bewildered that otherwise moral and respectable girls would lose their minds over gyrating singers on stage. Perhaps they could sense the future phenomenon of groupie culture. This sparked the New York Times to ponder in 1956, is this generation going to hell? At the root of the dislike for rock and roll was racism and the accompanying fear of integrated schools. As rock first gained popularity in integrated venues, some parents grew concerned about what else kind of race mixing teens would do if allowed in the same schools. Said one white Alabama mother in 1956, as you know, some colored people look even better than some whites, and you take a girl who didn't stand in with the white boys so good right on the start, she might say, well, there's a good looking colored boy, I'll just take him. Said another white parent to a Louisiana state senator, what, pray God, is going to happen to the psyche of genteelly raised white children, particularly little girls, when deliberately thrown among these uninhabited, boisterous, undisciplined, unrestrained, primitive aborigines? With sentiments like these, it's no wonder that upon integrating in the 1970s, some school districts required segregated proms or social activities, or even canceled them altogether. This trepidation of integrated high schools and white teens catching jungle fever didn't dissipate, instead remaining a central theme of white parents, especially on the religious right. So you've got the sexual revolution of the 60s, an increase in comprehensive sex ed programs, the introduction of the birth control pill for non-married women in 1972, and legal abortion in 1973, and desegregation busing throughout the 70s. LGBTQ people were more vocal in their experiences. Mini skirts and platform heels were in vogue. Cosmopolitan porn films were screened at movie theaters. In the early 70s, North Carolina and South Carolina had the highest concentration of adult theaters. Women were entering college in the workforce in record numbers, trampling the territory of previously male-exclusive arenas. Advertisers began tapping into sex as a selling tool, and Hollywood also became more explicit. Many teens could get their first glimpses of sex in a parent's Playboy magazine or in a copy of the 1972 bestseller, The Joy of Sex. The marriage and maternal rates declined and would continue to do so going into the 21st century. More and more couples were shacking up or cohabitating, as in living together before marriage. Premarital sex rates among white women boomed, and the decriminalization of miscegenation meant more choices for partners, albeit to extreme disapproval. A study found that except among black couples, oral sex was becoming a more widely standard sexual practice. Sex advice could be found on the covers of magazines and prominent racks at supermarkets. Those are a lot of big changes if you've been paying attention to Let's Talk About Sex History. Studies of Americans across race, class, age, and religion found that increasingly the group most likely to disapprove of the new sexual atmosphere were older and devoutly religious. One denomination turned their disapproval into political power and a lucrative business. I'm of course talking about evangelicals. Throughout the 70s and 80s, they embarked on a number of campaigns targeting alternative sexualities under the guise of protecting the youth from bad influences. A major example is that of country singer Anita Bryant, who went on a cross-country tour speaking out against gay rights. Another major target was unwed teenage pregnancy, which ironically enough was higher in places without comprehensive sex ed programs, thanks to the likes of evangelicals. According to Intimate Matters, in 1976, among the premaritally sexually active, 27% of white girls and 45% of blacks had become pregnant by the age of 18. These statistics can be partially explained by an early 1970s survey of high school teens that revealed over half received no conversations about sex from parents. So while sex itself was becoming more permitted in the public realm, restrictive attitudes about teens who not even 100 years ago were old enough to be considered adults and to work and to get married were now not old enough to learn how to have safe sex. As we talked about in episode 4 of Let's Talk About Sex History, abstinence-only education mandates did a lot to exacerbate teen pregnancy and STD rates. But now, let's turn our attention to the purity movement and its impact on teens. In multiple multiple intellectual media videos and essays, I've addressed how evangelicals changed the landscape of the country at the end of the 20th century. And during that same time the evangelicals were expanding and consolidating their political power, they were also attempting to reach the youth. There was an explosion of Christianity and pop culture in the 80s and 90s thanks to televangelism and the advancement of technology. Born-again virginity, like its counterpart born-again Christianity, really took off in the 1980s. Born-again virgins are people who have had sex but take a vow to abstain until marriage. In April 1993, members of the Southern Baptist Convention created the True Love Waits organization to promote sexual abstinence to teens and college students. Just 2 months later, over 10,000 Baptist churches had begun implementing the program, and it would come to be a part of at least 100 other denominations. The very next year, True Love Waits hosted a rally on the National Mall and proudly displayed over 200,000 signed cards from teens who wanted to remain pure. The cards read, "Believing that true love waits, I make a commitment to God, myself, my family, those I date, my future mate, and my future children to be sexually pure until the day I enter a covenant marriage relationship." Purity rings and themed clothing also became popular and highly profitable around this time. In 1995, Silver Ring Thing, another purity organization, was founded to battle America's perceived unhealthy obsession with sex, which the evangelical founder saw as a result of the 1960s sexual revolution. It garnered support by throwing teen-friendly events with Christian rock music and party atmospheres. Though Silver Ring Thing was founded upon Christian ideals of virginity and purity and therefore was promoting Christianity itself, the program is funded with U.S. tax dollars. By 2004, it had received over $1.1 million in federal funding. 1 year later, the American Civil Liberties Union sued the U.S. Department of Health for giving money to an organization that promoted Christianity, violating the separation of church and state. And for 2 years, the organization didn't receive money while they revised their standards to be secular. Personally, I don't see how an organization that promotes virginity because of Christian concepts of sex and purity, how it can be secular in the eyes of the government. But here we are. In 1997, a 23-year-old Christian homeschooled pastor named Joshua Harris published a book he wrote when he was 21 named I Kiss Dating Goodbye. The tome would become a central component of the Christian purity movement, especially among homeschoolers. In his book, Harris encouraged Christian teens to give up dating. No hanging out with the opposite sex one-on-one, no kissing, or even holding hands. Instead, they were encouraged to return to the courtship style of romance that existed in the 19th century. He argued that this would save teens and young people from heartbreak and sin while preparing them to be good partners in marriage. In October 2018, Harris retracted his statements in this book and asked his publisher to stop creating new copies. He even released a documentary titled I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, in which people discussed how the book impacted their relationships and even led to divorces. 1 year after I Kissed Dating Goodbye, purity balls entered the scene by way of a Colorado couple. If you haven't heard, purity balls are prom-like events where girls are escorted by their fathers for a night of dancing, eating, and manners, complete with each daughter's vow to be pure and chaste until marriage, while the fathers vow to be keepers of their virginity until a husband comes into the picture and takes over. I know, right? Kind of incestuous and gross. Even grosser is that the girls who take part in these events aren't always teens or even preteens, meaning they're making such a big promise while not even old enough to fully understand what they're doing. So with all of these purity-centric activities and organizations, paired with the abstinence-based educations we discussed in episode 5, what is the payoff? Well, studies have found virginity pledgers are more likely to delay sex, but less likely to use contraception when they do have sex, more likely to experience feelings of shame after they have sex, and that virginity pledgers have significant amounts of anal and oral sex. Unfortunately, insulated communities and groups that emphasize sexual purity among teens, especially women, face challenges of guilt and secrecy when it comes to sexual abuse. This is what happens when you tell women that they're chewed up pieces of trash for having sex. The event that made Joshua Harris reconsider the advice he doled out in his book was a sex abuse scandal at his own church. The same organization that started True Love Waits, the Southern Baptist Convention, was recently revealed to have over 380 church leaders and volunteers who faced sexual misconduct allegations since 1998. Many of these perpetrators had multiple victims, with at least 700 identified and many more unknowns. The Southern Baptist Convention, as it turns out, bans queer pastors, but not convicted sex offenders. You know, the same Southern Baptist Convention that was first erected to protect slavery and in 1947 declined to seek improving race relations. This is symbolic of an overarching theme in evangelical culture: the dominance of the straight white male, who can always be redeemed. esteemed. This is further demonstrated by the racism that permeates the purity movement. Many of the same Christians who advocated for teen purity in the 70s, 80s, and 90s were active opponents of desegregation busing, believing it would lead to interracial relationships in school hallways and the mongrelization of the white race. When you read up on modern fundamentalist Christians, you'll see that most of them are still obsessed with private schools and teen purity. Episode, you've seen how the dating habits of American teens has evolved throughout the 20th century before the proliferation of the internet. Most significantly along this timeline was the creation of the category of teen, in which social scientists, religious leaders, and parents looked at the teenage years as a puzzling, problematic, and potentially promiscuous era of life, nestled between the innocence of childhood and the legitimacy of adulthood. It was known that teens had sexual desires and feelings, but they have not always been accepted or acknowledged outright. Instead, those feelings and desires were expected to be groomed into the acceptable lane of marriage. People like to say a lot that they like to return to the old days when the country had more morals before promiscuity and provocative behavior. But this simple desire misses the reality of class, regional, and race differences when it came to sexuality. When studying the past and reading stories about teens who got married to have sex, the prevalence of shotgun marriages and other things we discussed in this video, it becomes clear that promiscuity isn't new, and nor are the puritanical reactions to it. In the next episode of Let's Talk About Sex History, we'll be discussing sterilization and rape culture on American soil. Thanks so much for watching.